Closed captioning for Lakeland Currents is supported by the Minnesota Department of Commerce, Telecommunications Access Minnesota, and Nisswa Tax Service. Nisswa Tax Service, tax preparation for businesses and individuals. Across from City Hall in Nisswa and online at nisswatax.com.
Hello again, everyone. This is the segment that we're doing on rural Minnesota. And if you were able to watch our little segment we did with the Blandin Foundation on Minnesota Pulse, we're trying to identify some of the real key issues that are affecting rural Minnesota, and it's not as bleak as a lot of people may think. And so part of what we're doing in our series on rural Minnesota is looking at some of the good things that are happening and the options that are out there for people. And tonight I have a real expert on this whole topic. His name is Ben Winchester, and his family does not make rifles. No. Do they, Ben?
No. I wouldn't have student loans if we did.
And Ben is a research fellow for the Extension Center for Community Vitality at the University of Minnesota. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here. Maybe you could start out, Ben, by telling us what is the Extension Center for Community Vitality.
Sure. I think a lot of people are familiar with the Extension Service in general, and a lot of people know 4-H. And that's in one of the homes or one of the centers of the University of Minnesota Extension. I'm actually housed under the Center for Community Vitality, which is an area that's somewhat new to Extension and involves people in training for leadership, for economic development, decision-making, conflict management. We've got a number of different programs that help promote the vitality of our rural communities.
If people have been following the Extension area of the University of Minnesota over the last 10 or 12 years, they know there's been huge changes. A lot of cuts, a lot of programs have been wiped away that used to be a part of the Extension Service area. So it's really nice from my perspective to see that the university still is investing in the rural study area, because that's where so many of us actually do live. Tell me what I love what you've got here. The narrative is usually dominated by dying, bleeding, out-migration, and population loss. What's your perspective on that? What are you saying there?
Sure. I'm fairly new to the field. I'm roughly 17 years into doing rural development across the state of Minnesota, and also did some work in Missouri for my graduate work. But I noticed that the narrative was consistently dominated by some of the deficits that we've got. So the young kids are leaving, where we see businesses closing on Main Street, school consolidations, the loss of farm workers through agriculture, the expansion of farming operations into much larger facilities that ultimately reduce the number of family farms. So, it's through this lens I initially got into the field, and I started thinking, boy, why am I doing this work if it's going to be a constant struggle to keep these small towns vital and operating? But as I found through my research, rural areas have actually been pretty vibrant. A lot of the language that we use to describe the changes that we've seen dominates the literature. It dominates the headlines. When we think about some of the challenges that rural Minnesota has had, a lot of it occurred in the 1900s. And so early 1900s, we had the changes in agriculture, changes in transportation systems, communication systems started to change. And the second half of the 1900s, really, especially early on, saw changes in Main Street, the rise of regional centers. So not necessarily every town could be a retail hotspot. We had the rise of the Alexandrias, the different, Pelican Rapids, the Wilmers, the Pipestones, the places like that, where the towns immediately surrounding them started to struggle, economically anyway, as they had to adjust to this restructuring. And as I continued to do research, I found out actually from the 1970s through the 2000s, there was what we called a rural rebound, that we actually had more people living in rural areas than we did previously.
Really?
In fact, between 1970 and today, more people live in rural areas today than they did in 1970. But the statistic that gets thrown out, and I'm kind of a self-proclaimed data geek, is the statistic that's thrown out is that back in 1970, about 24% of our population lived in rural areas, and that dropped to about 17% today. Well, that would, when you see that headline, that makes you think that the rural areas are actually declining. Well, actually, the population is just concentrating itself more in the urban areas, but that doesn't mean we haven't been growing. So rural populations as a percentage of the whole have been shrinking, but rural areas in general have been growing in its population.
In Minnesota, how do you define rural? When you look at the communities in central Minnesota, for example, like in Aiken, Crosby, Brainerd, St. Cloud, Bemidji, are they all considered rural if they're a population of over or under a certain population?
Yeah, there are actually probably 22 different definitions that the federal and state government uses to define rural. But generally, it's initially the 7-county metro area, and rural is then a residual. It's, what's not urban is left as rural. But at the same time, we know that the Rochester area is fairly urbanized. We know that the La Crosse, Winona area is fairly urbanized, St. Cloud area, Fargo, Moorhead, Duluth to some extent, and Mankato. And I believe Blue Earth County is actually going to be designated an urban county when they start doing the reclassifications here early next year.
I know there's an organization in Minnesota, and I'm sorry I forgot the name of it, that's doing research on the trend to get away from big box stores and to move back into small retail shops and stores. And I know they did some work in the Brainerd area on this because we have 3 or 4 big box stores in this particular area.
Sure.
And that was another way of possibly getting vitality back into communities if there is a move away from that in the retail sector. What are you seeing there?
Well, I think it depends how you define vitality. A lot of times growth brings its own issues. And growth itself is not going to be able to solve the problems that incur or that are the result of growth. So in a sense, it's how we define vital, a vital community might actually be towns that remain a stable population. It doesn't have to necessarily be a growing population. And the economic base is being impacted not just by big box retailers, but there's efforts of globalization impacting us all. I mean, we've got Amazon Prime shipping. That'll get you anything to your house in 2 days. And these kind of restructurings that we've seen on Main Street started a good 15, 20 years ago. They aren't something that just happened recently. So the challenges that we've seen really on Main Street, they become more apparent in rural areas. Because when you see your only hardware store close, it becomes much more apparent in your small towns how dependent you were. But at the same time, the exact same dynamics are happening in urban areas too, but it's not as apparent because you may have 3 or 4 stores offering the same product. So the closing of one, it doesn't become as apparent. So I think some of these issues are urban and rural alike, only it becomes more pronounced in rural areas because of the microcosm that a rural area is of a much larger world.
It seems to me that having lived in this area all my life, the 70s is when we started seeing that move towards a regionalized shopping area, I guess would be the proper way of saying that. And I live in a rural community in a small town, and we can't buy a suit. I think we can buy socks in our community, but there's just so many things that we can't buy anymore. And it's hard for those retailers to actually open a store and have the business. They can't price-wise compete with these larger stores. But from the 70s and the 80s and 90s, at what time did that sort of slow down and level out?
Well, we're always in a constant state of flux. I mean, things are consistently changing. To the extent that we see boarded up businesses every day, it's not to such a great extent that we had in, say, the 80s, especially, or the early 90s. But there were multiple trends going on. So really on one side, you had the rise of regional centers, where a larger business was able to afford the economies of scale to make purchases of products to offer them at a discounted rate, where a local hardware store doesn't have that economy of scale to be able to get decent discounts on items. So that's on one side, but on the other, you've got this globalization effort where now we've got a global world and global labor to tap into that ultimately can produce products even cheaper, which then even retailers in a regional center cannot afford the prices that you can get at much larger chain stores as well.
I know one of your areas of real interest is migration. And what are you seeing in terms of migration in and out of our rural communities?
Sure. This is one of my favorite topics. We tend to view rural areas through the lens of the brain drain. And the brain drain is when our young people leave their communities. And it's when they graduate from high school, they may go off to college, they'll go off and find a job in the Twin Cities area. And it is an issue. It is happening. But our research shows anywhere between 40 to 60, 70% of all rural youth leave their community. So, if your small town is losing its children to the urbanized areas, on one side, it's actually good news for your school system to show that you are preparing your kids for the larger world. I mean, that is the goal of our education system. But on the other hand, it's the rule that you lose your kids, not the exception. So when communities beat themselves up over the fact that they're losing their kids, they'd be going against the grain to try to stop it, as opposed to trying to engage in efforts that actually keep the kids in the town. And so I've been challenging some of the thinkers out there doing rural studies to think more broadly about this population dynamic. So, yep, we do lose those 18 to 25-year-olds as they move out of our small towns, but our research has shown that we actually get 30 to 49-year-olds moving to every rural county in the state. So
Really?
even in the southwestern part of Minnesota and the western border counties, where overall you see population decline, there are 30 to 45 to 49-year-olds in a lot of areas moving into these communities, and they're bringing with their kids aged 10 to 14.
What's attracting those people?
We've done studies. So we worked in a 5-county region in western Minnesota, and this has been replicated in Nebraska as well, and the findings were very similar, is that top 3 reasons why people move to rural communities were slower pace of life, just less congestion. It was a quality of life issue. Second reason is safety and security, and this was especially rated high for those with young children. And the third was the low cost of housing. And even in the top 8 reasons, nowhere in there did you find jobs. So people are moving to rural areas for quality of life issues. And we've conducted interviews with 120 newcomers. We send out surveys to a couple hundred and gotten those results back, and they've been fairly interesting. And this is the piece of the population dynamic. So we lose the young people, we bring in these 30 to 49-year-olds, but then there's almost another split where in north central Minnesota, the high Amati area will capture people above the age of 50 and all the way up to retirement. So there's, I almost call it a breathing in and out of our population dynamic. So the young people as they graduate go to the Twin Cities. I mean, there's only 7 counties in the state that gain people aged 20 to 24. There's only, a very small number. So when people move to the metro, they may meet a spouse, meet a partner, move to the suburb. And then from there, it becomes a big life cycle decision, is what it's called in academic circles, is that there's these life cycle dynamics where people make a choice again to move. And we found that there is a societal preference for living in rural Minnesota. And not just Minnesota, but actually all across the upper Midwest. So in a way, we might, when we use total population figures, like, say my home county lost 1,000 people, well, actually we probably lost 2,000 young people and gained in 1,500 people aged 30 to 45. Well, we ultimately saw a loss.
A net loss.
A net loss. And a lot of people use total population figures as a measure of success or vitality. So if we only use total numbers as a measure of vitality, we're missing the depth of the dynamics of population change that we find across the whole state, urban and rural alike.
That's really fascinating. And I know in our area, Brainerd would be considered a rural area, I'm sure. This whole stretch of 10 and 210 and 371 would be. But I know a lot of the people who work in smaller communities often, or work in the larger communities, live in the smaller communities, like
Yes.
Pillager's close by. A lot of people who work in Brainerd live in Pillager, or they may live in Pine River across Lake. So I'm sure that's all part of your statistics when you look at that distance factor there.
You bet. It's really interesting how people's playgrounds are fairly large. So we haven't done any academic studies. We've done informal studies asking people, how far do you go to work? How far do you go to shop? How far do you go to play? And there's a 45-mile radius around a rural person's home where they shop in one place, they work in another, they play in another. It is, I call it the middle of everywhere. We live in the middle of everywhere. If I want to get to the Twin Cities, I can. It is an option, but I'm not embedded in that atmosphere. So what we've also found is part of the brain drain literature focuses on, losing the young people and, the choices that they make in order to make that move. So part of my argument here in trying to reframe this rural discussion is, yes, we are losing our 18 to 25-year-olds, and these young people have a high school education with a lot of promise, but they've not got no guarantee for success. When we do have, and we do know that there is this migration coming back or to rural places, and these people have high education levels, high incomes, they've got networks, they've got careers, they've got families. So to use the term brain drain to describe our rural communities does a serious disservice to those people who are actually choosing to move back to our rural communities.
So, and you call it brain gain.
Brain gain. So I'm going to counter the language a little bit and say, well, what is, and not to balance one against the other, but again, we're losing an 18-year-old with a high school education, and we're gaining in a family with a master's degree on one and maybe a bachelor's on another, and a child, and they're contributing to the school funding for the school. I mean, for every newcomer in a study that we've done, Bridget Tuck and David Nelson with Extension Community Vitality have done an economic impact analysis, and they found that every newcomer that moves back to the community brings with earning and spending power of about $100,000 every year.
Wow.
So where do we invest our time in terms of economic development these days? So this is part of a much larger dynamic, and it's also, just to counter one myth, is that a lot of people will say that, well, it's just the kids who used to live there that are moving back. And what we found is only 43% of newcomers to rural communities had any previous contact there. So it was, and there wasn't really a pattern to it. It was more anecdotal. It was things like, well, I used to go to Bible camp up at Alexandria when I was a kid, and I always loved the area. So we started looking around. And generally, these newcomers look at anywhere between 3 and 5 communities that they look to choose from.
How much does technology play a role in these people being able to come back to rural areas? I mean, are some of these jobs connected to technology, where they're able to work out of their home, for example, or isn't that a big factor?
I'd say it's a factor, but we don't have any hard data. I mean, there's not even data at the state level to tell us how many telecommuters there are. I mean, this deed does not, we do not capture this data at the state or federal level. Anecdotally, we've heard of writers, copywriters, architects, engineers that have been able to do their work from rural Minnesota, but we've got no systematic data to show that it's a pull. If anything, if you didn't have broadband, it may be a push away. But a lot of our rural communities, and we're working on this topic in Extension, are becoming modernized with fiber technology, with training, getting our small businesses online. There's some work to be done, but it's being done.
So one of the things your organization does, obviously, is to provide some training for rural communities who are interested in attracting businesses and people to their particular area.
You bet.
What are some of the training opportunities that people would have? Let's say there's a city council person or a mayor of a community watching the show tonight. What are things that they could expect if they contacted your organization?
Sure. On the leadership side, there's a lot of good opportunities within Extension to give you best practices in how to deal with conflict management, how to arrive at consensus decisions, how to build social capital within your community. That's a fairly large topic for us and very important for our rural communities.
What do you mean by social capital?
Social capital is the networks you have with others in the community. And this is, decisions are rarely made on an island, and there's a push to have more and more civic engagement efforts in the decision-making process. So we've got an initiative in the social capital area that works on identifying how well connected are the community groups within your community. Do they work in isolation? How often do they communicate with one another, cooperate with one another, up to collaborate with one another? So this is an opportunity for small towns to actually make better, wise use, efficient use of their limited resources that they've got in terms of time, people, money, things of that sort.
Globalization, can it work for rural communities, or is it working against rural communities?
It's working for and against urban and rural communities alike. I think there are opportunities there. And again, this is part of the narrative, is we only hear the downside of it, but at the same time, it's opening up markets that we've never had access to before. We've got incubators and ideas across rural Minnesota that a lot of our businesses in Minnesota were started in rural areas. So the ability to kind of step up the process of business planning has become easier with technology as you get connected to folks with the Small Business Development Center, as you get connected to SCORE groups. That type of knowledge base that's out there and how to make something successful is at your fingertips these days.
What's your experience been working with communities of 500 people? Are they sort of locked into a certain way of thinking, or are you finding these communities open to new ideas too?
They're open to ideas as long as they're good. I think everybody's open to good ideas. It hasn't been my experience that anybody's closed off the door to anything. We don't know the path forward economically today, but we do know that, for instance, the economic base of rural areas has changed. I mean, it used to be agriculture as a dominant industry, but that was 50 years ago.
How many people are involved in agriculture in rural Minnesota now?
Less than 1 in 10 of the people living in rural areas, and most of the counties, it's actually less than 5%.
Wow.
And that includes those actually on the farm, as well as things like implement dealers and seed dealers and things like that. So this is part of my, the revisioning of rural. We've got to expand our idea of what rural is. And right now, the way it's framed nationally is we've got rural development is housed under the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Well, if we're going to envision all of our development rural areas solely in terms of agriculture, it actually misses the boat in terms of seeing how much development there can be in a rural community. So they've, it's not to say they haven't done a good job and they've expanded some boundaries, but continually, I think it's a framework setting that if we're continually defining rural by agriculture, we're not realizing the potential and the vitality that rural communities do have.
This is a voice, I think, that's not heard much, the things you're talking about. I don't think that's heard much. I don't think it's featured on our radio and television shows much, or in our newspapers. The local news is, but it's just very interesting, your broader perspective. I know you've done some work in Iowa and North Dakota, and I would guess that those communities are similar in their trends of what we are here in Minnesota. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's exactly true. Like take Nebraska, for example, where Nebraska has witnessed some severe population decline, especially in the panhandle in the western part of the state. But I've got colleagues down there that see the same exact trend. It's the rural rebound that's been happening in Nebraska too. Yep, they lose the kids, but they gain in these 30 to 49-year-olds. So there's a big potential here to actually capitalize on the fact that these people have been moving into our rural communities without us doing anything. So, we've left it up to the people to search out the right community for themselves, to search out a job for themselves, a school for themselves. But I'm working with a group in western Minnesota, the Upper Minnesota Valley Regional Development Commission, that actually is engaging newcomers in basically finding a relocation service for them. So we know people are busy every day, and how much time do you really have to research out, well, it might be nice to move to Dawson one day or to move to Hancock. They don't know exactly where to look or how to find out that information. So I think the efforts we've started there are going to pay off in the sense that we do have this trend of people with an interest and motivation of living in rural communities, but people are short on time. So how can we balance that and really help incentivize that movement of people and their preference to rural areas?
I know one of the things that you talk about is sustainable growth. And what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think this is a difficult topic to talk about what's sustainable. One of the examples I've got is in terms of leadership. And so historically, our community groups in rural areas, we got the Rotary, the Lions Clubs, Red Cross, groups like that. These newcomers tend not to be involved in those groups. The newcomers have a different way of involving themselves socially. So, for example, between 2000 and 2009, the Minnesota population grew by about 7%. But at the same time, the number of nonprofits in Minnesota went up by 20%.
Really?
So this shows an interest in being active socially. So the whole Putnam idea, Robert Putnam's idea that people are bowling alone, people just aren't active socially anymore. Well, yeah, people aren't bowling, but they may be bicycling now. So it depends on where you look to find these people serving in leadership roles. So we've been doing some studies anyway to find out which communities are having a more difficult time in terms of, their population may be flat, but their number of nonprofits went up by 25%. Where are they going to find the leaders to serve on those boards?
Wow.
How are we going to compete, basically? Our nonprofit groups are in a competition over the limited resources that are our rural people, our people's time, our people's money, our people's efforts. So this, for me, is one of the areas that's a good challenge to have, in the sense that we have people active socially, and our data and research backs this up, that people are involved civically all over the place. They're just not involved in the historical groups. So this is where we almost are seeing a doubling of the number of community groups every 20 years. And if we don't do something to manage that process, it's going to lead to, we've heard about the term burnout, that people get burned out, they wear multiple hats in our rural communities, and it's true. But we've actually done research that shows how many community groups do you have and how many people do you have to serve on those boards. So, for example, in the metropolitan counties, you may have 70 people to draw upon for your president position. You may have another 70 to draw upon for your vice president position. But in rural communities, it's more like 1 in 15. 1 in 20 people have to serve as a leader in a nonprofit group. And this isn't volunteers. I mean, so basically one person on every rural city block has to serve in a leadership position in our nonprofit groups. So this for me is a question of sustainability. How long can we keep this up before the services that are provided by our nonprofit groups begin to suffer? And that's where if we're proactive about this, and there may be some community groups that need to be closed down. There may be some that need to be merged. We've got a lot of duplication of goals, of services by some of these organizations. And at the same time, we've got, especially in some of the historical groups, some really talented people who are struggling to get new people to the table. Well, the new people aren't coming to their table.
So when you do your training, that's some of the work that you do, is to help these communities understand that?
Yes.
That's pretty interesting. Yeah. Very interesting.
So this is for me, it's a good problem to have, is the fact that people like to be active and like to be social. So,
but burning them out is a way of stopping all that good activity, isn't
yeah,
it? So
if you walk in the door for a group you're interested in and you see 3 people sitting at the table and you know all of a sudden you're going to have to shoulder 25% of the load, you're probably just going to turn right back around.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we've got another area of talk about is the economy. We're down to about 2 minutes, so but
Great.
Let me just briefly say a few things about the economy before we have to close out.
So I had mentioned earlier a little bit about the changes we saw in agriculture, and really agriculture as a dominant industry for rural America has not been true since 1955, 1965, right in that period there. And that began the transition into manufacturing as a primary industry for rural areas. But even that has been on the decline, and the dominant industries in rural America today are education and health services. And so it's not just caring for our kids, but it's caring for our people in general. So this actually, for me, is a pretty good trait of rural areas, is that we like to care for our people and our children. So as we've gone through these transitions in economic structures, it's reflected in the people that are interested in coming to rural areas too. So there's been a trend of proprietorship. We've got kind of this independence that rural people have, and I know it's a notion, and you can't always prove that it's true, as opposed to people who live in urban areas or whatnot. But the fact is, we've got a lot of proprietors living in rural areas, and these are people who start small businesses. In fact, in the counties immediately surrounding Crow Wing here, 30 to 45% of all the people living and working in these areas are proprietors.
Wow.
These are people that don't have wage and salary jobs, but they're working for themselves, and a lot of times they don't show up on our economic data.
I'm going to have to cut you off.
Right.
We're out of time. We're going to have you come back, man, and talk again, because this is fascinating information. And again, your website is?
Extension.umn.edu.
Thank you. You've been watching Lakeland Currents, where we're talking about what you're talking about. I'm Ray Gildow. So long until next time.